All right, so the first pattern that we're going to talk about here is the observer pattern. Now, the main theme with the observer pattern and the main situation where you would use the observer pattern is whenever there's something in your program that a lot of other parts of your program need to watch and know whenever it updates, right? Now, this could be something as simple as an internet connection, right? Obviously, there's lots of pieces in a web application that need to be notified whenever the internet connection either connects or disconnects, but there's actually a lot of other things in everyday programs that follow this sort of template as well. So, all right, now in order to demonstrate this, what we're going to do is create a new TypeScript project, and the way that we're going to do that, I'm currently in our custom types project from a little bit earlier in the course. So I'm going to change directories out of that and use the make directory command to create a new directory. So we'll just call this one something like design patterns, and then we'll change directories into there. And in fact, let's just open that up in a new IDE window. So we'll say code design patterns. And once that's open, we're going to initialize a new TypeScript project inside of here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to open up a terminal inside this directory, and we'll say tsc-init, and that will give us a new tsconfig.json file. So the next thing that we're going to do here is we'll just create a new folder called source, and we'll do the same kind of setup that we did earlier. What we're going to do is we're just going to need to specify the input files, right? The TypeScript files that we want to actually modify. So let's say include, and then this is going to be just an array, and inside here we'll have /source/double asterisk, there we go, /*.ts. So that will get all of the TypeScript files inside the source directory here, and then we just need to go find the out directory property inside this tsconfig.json file, and we're going to uncomment that and change it to build. Cool, so now that we've done that, what we're going to do is create a new file inside our source directory, and we'll call this file observer.ts, right? And this is where we'll create the different pieces of a program that would demonstrate the observer pattern. Now, not surprisingly, the first thing that we're going to implement in the observer pattern is an interface called observer that will contain all of the things that the observers, right, the parts of our program that need to be notified whenever something changes, have in common. So what this is going to look like is we're going to say interface observer. And then the one thing that all observers in pretty much any program are going to have in common is a method called update that allows whatever they're subscribing to, whether that's an internet connection or waiting for something else in the program to happen, can call in order to notify all of the observers that something has changed. So what we're going to do here is we're going to call that method update. And inside here, we're going to add an argument called value. And initially we'll set this as a string, but in reality what you could do is allow the observer class to be a generic class where you can pass in or otherwise specify the type of data that this observer is going to be dealing with. And actually, that's pretty easy to do. So let's just add a generic type t here, and then we'll make the value of type t instead. Okay, and since this is an interface, we're not going to implement this function. We're just going to add the type void as the return type, since more often than not, observers won't want to return anything in this update method, right? It'll just be a method that gets called and makes some sort of change in the observer itself. And that's really all that we need to do for the observer interface. So, all right, so now that we have this interface, let's create a simple subject. And subject is the term for whatever this thing is that the observers are observing, whether that's the internet connection or waiting for a file to open or waiting for a response from somebody, whatever the case. We're just going to create a simple class, which we'll call subject. And really the main responsibility of any subject, right, of anything that's getting observed in the observer pattern is to keep track of all of the observers that it has to notify whenever something changes. All right, so in our case, what we're going to do is keep an array of observers as an instance variable in this subject class. So what that's going to look like is we're going to say private observers, and this is going to be an array of type, oops, not object, observer. And we'll initialize this as an empty array just by saying equals empty array. Now, you'll notice that TypeScript isn't happy with what we just did there, and that's because it wants us to specify a generic type for this observer interface. So for now, let's just set this to a string, although, depending on what type of subject this is, that data type could really be anything, right? If you're waiting to hear back with user data from a server, let's say, this data type could be some custom type that you've defined that contains user data. But for now, just to keep things simple, we'll create our subject that uses a string as its main data type. All right, now besides that, really the only other thing that our subject needs to have is some sort of value that can change. And when that value changes, it's going to tell all of its observers about it. So for now, we'll just say private, and we'll call this value, and that's going to be of type string. And if you want to set it to an initial value, we'll just set it to an empty string there. Okay? Cool. So now that we have the observers and the value, the next thing that we're going to need to add to our subject is a method that will allow us to add another observer as a sort of subscriber. All right, so what that's going to look like is we're just going to say public, and we'll call this method something like add observer, although you might see other names for this method such as subscribe used. And what this is going to do is it's going to take an observer as an argument, right? An observer of type string, of course, and we'll call that observer with a lowercase o there. And it's just going to add it onto this observers array. So we'll say this dot observers dot push observer. Okay, and actually I did that completely backwards here. I specified this using more Java notation than anything else, so let's try this in TypeScript notation. We're just going to say observer string like so, and that's all we need to do. So now whenever we add an observer, that's just going to add that observer onto this array of observers that our subject will need to notify when the value changes. So the last thing that we're going to need to do here is we're going to need to add a method for changing this value here. And what that's going to look like is we're going to say public set value, and we'll say new value, and that'll be a string, of course. And all we need to do inside this method is update this instance variable value to whatever new value is. So let's just say this dot value equals new value. And then what we need to do is loop through all of the observers here and notify each one of them using this update method here that the value has changed. So what that's going to look like is we're just going to say this dot observers, and we can even use JavaScript or TypeScript's built-in for each method. To each observer, we're just going to say observer, and then we'll say observer dot update, and we're going to pass that new value as an argument there. So that will make sure that all of the observers of this subject class are notified whenever something changes. So now that we have the observer interface and the subject class, let's just create another class that implements this observer interface. So what that's going to look like is we'll just create a class called something like log observer. And all that this is going to do is it's going to automatically log out any changes that it observes. So in order to make this log observer actually implement this interface that we created up above, and therefore make it satisfy this type declaration when we want to add it to the subject, what we need to do is we need to say implements, and then the name of the interface is observer. And this will basically tell TypeScript that this log observer is going to have that update method that we had up above. So what that's going to look like, and by the way, you'll notice this little red underline here asking for a generic type. Let's say that our log observer is going to be an observer of type string. And now that we have that, you'll see a red underline under the class name. And if you hover over that, you'll see that really all that it's complaining about is that it doesn't have this update method that we said it would have in this interface. So all that means is we need to just say update and define that method ourselves. In fact, my IDE has been so kind as to define all of that for me. So now all we need to do is implement whatever behavior we want to be executed when some update is detected. And in our case here, we're just going to say console.log. And what we'll do is we'll just say updated, the new value is, and then will print out the value, right? That'll be the purpose of this little log observer class. Cool, so now that we have an interface, a subject class, and a class that implements the observer interface, let's just test this out now by creating a simple example. All that we need to do for that is say let observer, right, little o observer equals, and we'll create a new log observer instance like so. And now what we need to do is just create a new subject. So we'll say let subject equals new subject. And really all that we need to do now is add this observer as an observer for this subject by saying subject.addObserver, and we can pass the observer as an argument there. And now whenever we say subject.setValue, right, whenever we change the value that is in this subject, right, so let's change it to something like design patterns with an exclamation point, of course. What we're going to see is that this observer here, right, this observer instance that we created earlier is automatically going to detect that change and do its thing, right? So let's just compile our code now by saying tsc, and sure enough, that will show up in our build folder. So let's now run the observer.js compiled file by saying node build/observer.js, and sure enough, we see that it says updated, the new value is design patterns. And if you want to see this in an even more graphic way, let's create several observers. So we'll say observer 1, and then we'll create observers 2 and 3. Okay, so we'll just say observer 2, observer 3. And now we just need to add all of these to our subject as observers. So we'll say observer 2 and observer 3. And now we'll see that whenever the subject updates, we get all 3 observers reacting to that update. So let's recompile our code. And if we run that observer.js file again, we'll see that sure enough, whenever there's a change to the value of the subject, all 3 observers are going to react to that. So anyway, that is the observer pattern. I hope that you find plenty of useful places to use this in the future.